Greetings and welcome back to 303 and to a series of lectures on introductions to English basic grammar and more particularly ACT prep. This is the second lecture, an introduction to grammar study itself. We're going to try to at least answer the question, what is it that we talk about when we talk about this word called grammar, right? Again, as I pointed out at the end of my last lecture, it's kind of silly to say I hate grammar because you actually have to use grammar to say I hate grammar, right? So for example, no one says hate I grammar, I mean, unless they're kind of goofing around or they're trying to talk like the character from that Star Wars movie, Yoda or something like that, you know. What you hate maybe is the study of grammar, not grammar, or as I pointed out, the absence of knowledge about grammar and grammar rules. We can feel kind of insecure. I know a lot of times professionally, if somebody finds out that I teach English and literature, one of the first kind of comments they'll often make is, "Ooh, I'll have to be careful about the way I talk around you because I don't know grammar very well." And of course, this is true that grammar has consistently been the study that most people equate with the thing they hate the most, right? Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the language itself when we talk about this. There's different words that get used for this. Different people will use these words in different ways. Syntax, for example, sometimes the word usage will be used. Punctuation and mechanics will sometimes be a part of our study of grammar. And then, of course, the word grammar itself. I'm going to give a working definition because, as I said in my first lecture, everything about what I want to talk with you guys about is I want it to make sense to you, simple, so you can use it. So let's say it this way. Grammar is basically the rules of spoken and written language, the rules. Now there are two sets of rules. We should point this out right away because very regularly I think students often misunderstand this about this use of the word grammar. There is informal grammar and then there is formal grammar, okay? Informal grammar are the grammar rules that are specific to small groups. These rules vary over time and can quickly change. For example, if a group of students are standing in the hall talking and I come up on them and clearly they're saying something that's positive and I say, "Groovy, dude," well, they might actually laugh at me. Of course, the funny question I will have in response is, "Well, you knew that when I said groovy, I was talking about something good, not something bad." Question, why'd you laugh? "Well, we don't use groovy anymore." Really, where did it go? And who told us that we had to stop using groovy? Well, see, this is the thing. I'm just giving you an example of the way that grammar rules within informal populations will move in and out. I mean, it's just the nature of it. They're constantly varying. How about this one? The student asked the teacher, "Can I go to the bathroom?" And the response, of course, this stupid response that all students loathe, "I don't know, can you?" Of course, the distinction that's being made here is the distinction between "can I go to the bathroom" and "may I go to the bathroom," right? And this is a grammatical distinction. But in informal culture, there's no reason to make a distinction like this at all. I mean, if I ask, "Can I go to the bathroom?" obviously what I'm asking is, will you allow me to go to the bathroom? The distinctions that's being drawn between can and may in informal grammar make absolutely no sense at all. Now, obviously, that makes sense if we're talking about formal grammar. We'll get to it in a moment, right? This is the same thing, for example, with the use of the word ain't or any number of other words that are supposedly not words at all, not appropriate or whatever. And people who are always wanting to correct your grammar, one of the observations that easily can be made by you is that you are using language in different kinds of settings. Okay? If you are talking with your pals or you're texting or whatever, there's a set of rules for you that are different from if you, for example, are talking with maybe a situation like a government official or you have to give a presentation in front of a bunch of adults and you want to look like you're at least quasi-educated. You're going to speak, you're going to think, you're going to write differently because you're going to use a different understanding of this word grammar, and it's formal grammar. Now, these are the rules that are standardized, although we have to put quotation marks around that in your notes as well, because we can say that they're standardized, but they change over time. The distinctions, for example, between who and whom and any number of other kinds of distinctions that once upon a time were set in stone, guess what? They start to change. And we have distinctions that we sometimes draw. I'll even mention some in my lectures between what we call British English and American English. These two different kinds of grammar often will even have variances. But by and large, think of the formal grammar as the rules that are standardized within an academic understanding, right, of how language should be spoken. In other words, These kinds of rules, if they do vary or change, they vary or change over time, over a long period of time, all right? So as usage and grammar come in and out of a language, at the formal level, it's going to take a long time for it to change a lot. Very slowly. The distinction, for example, between who and whom is others. And you can obviously think about other examples as well. If you want to do a little bit of research on this and Google this question, how has grammar, the English grammar, changed over the years? Obviously, that's a good project. Our project here is to work with ACT Prep. So our study is going to be the academic rules of, are you ready for this? Written English primarily, not so much spoken English, but there might be some carryover, obviously. But I mean, think about this for a moment. When you speak, you don't actually use question marks, right, when you speak. Although I did hear of a student recently who did ask to respond to her mother, where do you think you're going? And she said, where do you think I'm going? Rhetorically, and then she said afterwards, question mark? Well, of course, she'd been texting a lot, possibly. But for our purposes, we're focusing on written language, not spoken language. Let's go ahead and address the question, why is this garbage called grammar so unbelievably difficult? Well, I think that there's a lot of different ways to try and say this. I think possibly if you go back, the easiest answer is, if you go back to the study of the English language, it is a language that develops over a long period of time. Of course, it's a hybrid language. Lots of different languages are a part of it. We know that Latin and Greek were a part of those languages. There comes a time, though, in the history of the English language when it finally deserves its own status, and therefore academicians and people who do the kind of garbage I do for a living finally start studying, quote-unquote, studying the language. At the moment that happens, they look at the two languages they revere or respect the most. What are they? Latin and Greek. How many parts of speech do Latin and Greek both have? 8. Therefore, if there are 8 parts of speech in a legitimately studied language, English must have 8 parts of speech as well. Both of these languages having 8 parts of speech. Of course, the funny thing about that rule then is that, wow, an interjection becomes a part of speech. Wow is a part of speech. Seriously, we could begin to laugh already. Let's point out the traditional understandings of the quote-unquote 8 parts of speech, and here's the irony. There are some people that say, no, there's not 8 parts of speech, there are 9 parts of speech because you have to include what's called the article. We'll get to the article in a bit, in another lecture, but let's talk it through really quickly. Of course, you probably know these from your elementary years, and again, as I said in an earlier lecture, ACT will never actually ask you to define any of these, but because we're going to be using these parts of speech and the language, the nomenclature, then it makes sense probably for you to at least put them in your notes. And if you want to, you can pause the video for a second and see if you can remember these all on your own, just to kind of play a game with yourself and see how well you remember it. Of course, there's nouns, right? There's pronouns. Some people will include here the article as another part of speech, right? We got verbs. We got the modifiers that we call adjectives and adverbs. We'll get to those. Conjunctions. Of course, we have our prepositions, and then finally, wow, our interjections. These are understood to be the traditional 8, or if you will, 9 parts of speech, okay? You know, there's another answer to this thing about why grammar is perceived to be so difficult. And I mean, I hate to say this because obviously I do this for a living, and I have a lot of pals that as well do this for a living, but I think that we, English teachers, we have to have the finger pointed sometimes at us. I think sometimes we have liked to make this study seem a little bit more esoteric and difficult than it actually is. It may be the case that, for example, everybody knows physics is difficult, calculus is difficult, biology is difficult, but you know, English, I mean, how hard is it? You read something and you got to write something. I mean, really, how hard is it? Oh no, there's a science to what we do too, and it's called grammar. Let's make it as complicated as possible. You know, I think that you can always make any study more complicated, but I'm going to ask why? Right? Especially only if you want to, you know, someday teach this stuff, would you maybe worry about a lot of the reasons why the rules are the rules, you know, and all of that. Let's focus on just the essentials, shall we? So we can do well on the ACT, write better, possibly speak better when we need to, okay? The next thing I'll say is that everything about written English grammar is built off of the understanding of simply the sentence, okay? And by that I mean 2 things. 1, how it looks. 2, how it reads. Watch this. How it looks. If it's going to look a certain way, the understanding is we're going to have some kind of capital letter, right? Then we're going to have a string of words, right? And then we're going to have some kind of end punctuation. The end punctuation obviously can only be one of three. It'll be a period, it's going to be a question mark or exclamation mark, right? Now the understanding is when we are writing, and again this is formal. Dude, I don't do this when I text. Right, but that's different. When we are writing, right, there's an understanding that if you have a capital letter and then there's a string of words and then there's some kind of end punctuation, then what happens here is what we will call a sentence. Okay? That's the understanding for us. Okay? The second, however, understanding of a sentence is what we say, how it reads. Okay? So, in other words, iconically, we look at it, we go, oh, okay, that's supposed to be a sentence. In formal English grammar, this is understood to be a sentence. That's how it looks. But how it reads now is significant for us. So let's talk about that for a moment. For it to be a complete sentence in formal grammar, there have to be two parts to the sentence, which is why I have always argued that technically there's only two parts to English grammar. All these parts of speech. Really, technically, there's only two. Let's talk about it really quickly. You got to have some thing, and I would underline the word thing, doing, and I would put a box around the word doing, something. Okay? Some thing doing something. This thing we're going to call a noun. All right, we'll get to those later. Or sometimes we're going to call this subject. Okay, this thing. All right. And then, of course, this doing part, we're going to call these verbs. Sometimes we're going to use the term predicate, right? If we want to sound really smart, we're going to use that term. We'll get to that in a bit as well. Okay. Here's the key, and this is what I want you to write down, and this is what I need you to know, and this is the first important point about ACT usage grammar prep. You have to, in formal grammar, you have to have both parts to make sure it's a sentence. Okay? Now, just to point out, sometimes this thing, and now if you want to circle it, you can, is what we will call fuzzy or unclear, right? Okay? Unclear, the thing we're talking about can be, like for example, if I were to say, hey, give me that. Now see, I say give me that. You know that I'm talking about something, you're just not sure what I'm talking about. What are you talking about, give me that? For example, if I were to say, isn't he amazing? Well, isn't she amazing? Well, all depends on who the he, she is that we're talking about. Do you get it? In both cases, what we're talking about is we know something, but it's unclear. These unclear words we call pronouns, okay? And they're just another kind of a thing. And so we're going to have some rules about it. For example, we're going to say the thing that the pronoun is talking about, the thing it's talking about is what we call an antecedent. Ante, that which comes before. By the way, don't worry, we'll go into this in more detail. I'm just giving you kind of an overview here so you kind of have a sense of where we're headed, all right? Sometimes we want to clarify what the thing we're talking about is, and these are called modifiers, and the primary modifier of a thing is an adjective, right? So a blue house as opposed to a house, right? Okay, the house is obviously the thing. Sometimes we want to clarify the action, the verb, and so we have what are called adverbs, right? They add to the action of the verb is an easy way to think about it. Sometimes we want to connect ideas. To do that, we use conjunctions. Sometimes we want to explain place, and so we use these things called prepositions. About each one of these quote-unquote parts of speech, I'm going to have a little lecture for you so that you can have some clarification. And then, of course, sometimes we need to use the interjections. We're going to talk about interjections as being something that we actually use quite a bit, especially when we're really happy or really upset. But we're going to argue that we stay away from these interjections primarily in our formal writing. Okay. Let's finish, shall we? Our goal here is to learn the rules of each of these parts of a sentence and how they work. We want to pay attention to possible, here's the key, mistakes, so that we can recognize the mistakes right away. One of the simple questions is, though, and we're hitting it already, if there's a capital letter and there's in punctuation, do you have in between something, a subject noun, doing something? That is to say, action, verb, predicate. If you don't have both of those, you do not have a complete sentence. What we sometimes say, not a sentence, or N-A-S, right? Not a sentence. So right away, we're already meeting some really important information for ACT prep. Each one of the sentences that you look at, for example, in the grammar usage component of the ACT, the first question to always ask is it a sentence as it's being written in the formal approach, right? With a capital letter and in punctuation, okay? again, I'll say it one more time. Don't worry about the why of the rules. A lot of students get hung up with this. They almost get mad at me. Like, why is it the case that it's a comma splice with the comma, but if I put a little dot over the top and turn the comma into a semicolon, now it's okay? Like, who made up a stupid rule like that? To which I will respond again one more time. Look, dude, if you're interested in knowing the why of a lot of these rules, then you can research on your own, or you can go into the study of linguistics or language history or whatever. But for our purposes, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking to you about exactly why these rules are the rules. Like, for example, why is it the case that we have to have in formal grammar, why do we have to have a capital letter and in punctuation? Like, who made up that rule? Well, it's a good question, and there is an answer to it, but it's not an answer that I need to give here in this series of lectures, okay? Our approach, very simply, is to try to help you prepare with basic grammar understanding, usage understanding for tests, standardized tests like the ACT. Our approach here will not be using a textbook technically. I'll refer to any number of possible grammar practice books that we use at 303. For example, the Barron's Grammar Workbook by George Ermenhoff. I do recommend this one for your study. We've got this one here at Warren High School that we use, and if you want to follow along with my lecture, I'll be following some of what Dr. Ermenhoff does. I'm just interested in making sure that you understand these different kinds of rules and how these rules work and the potential mistakes that will come up on an ACT. With that in mind, I'll turn now to lecture number 3. Introduce you right away to the thing, that is to say, to nouns, and we're just going to review a few of the basic rules about subject, nouns, and the thing, right? Okay. So I hope that you've learned something in this lecture, and we'll come back to lecture 3 here in a bit. Thank you.